Hello everyone, welcome back to Fanblade. This week we're carrying on with the base. We're going to finish off the neck, finish off the body, and hopefully get some finish on both of them. We'll pick up where we left off last week with the frets freshly installed and ready to be glued in. Gluing in the frets is fairly straightforward. We're just going to drop a little bit of CA glue down these ends. You can almost, I don't know if you'll be able to see this on the video, but you can actually see it wicking down the fret, and that's how you know you've got enough in. Next we're going to file the fret ends. I'm going to use this block of wood that has a file cut into it at 35 degrees, and the file is set so that you can run the full length of the neck over it without damaging the headstock. You don't have to push too hard here, but you do have to keep cleaning off the jig, otherwise you'll get metal filings caught in your fingerboard. It's a good idea to check periodically. You're going to find that it'll kind of creep up on you. When you see sawdust on the file, that means that you've gone far enough. You just want to round off a little bit of the fingerboard itself, but not too much. So when you see wood on the file, that's your cue that you've gone far enough. There we are, ready for the next step, which is leveling the frets. This is a pretty involved process, and it's important to get it right. If your frets aren't leveled, then the strings are going to rattle against any high ones and the instrument won't play properly. So we're going to mask off all of the neck except for the frets, and then we're going to come in with a Sharpie and mark the tops of the frets so that we can see which ones we are filing more away from. This is something I've been meaning to do for a while. I level the frets with a mill saw second cut file. It's a slightly more forgiving file than a rasp file or a bastard file. It takes some finer cut, leaves a nicer surface finish, but I've never had a handle for it. So for the purposes of this video, I decided to glue one on. Being very careful to let the file do the work, you want to travel up the full length of the neck, making sure that you're paying attention to where the Sharpie is being removed and where it isn't. The high frets are going to have more to file off, and once you've filed enough off, then the Sharpie will be able to be taken off from the ones either side. The idea here is to get all of the frets to the same height, so you want to go carefully, evenly, and just carefully. And now that you've worn a flat spot onto every fret, we need to file them back round. The first step in doing this is to bring out the Sharpie again and mark the tops of the frets, so that you can see how much material you are removing with the crowning file. Crowning files come in different sizes. I am of course using jumbo fret wire, so I've got a jumbo crowning file. You want to file just until you can see that perfect line right up the centre of the fret. That's just about right. Some frets will take more than others. It depends how much you had to file off them to get them to be level. You've removed more material, so you need to work extra hard to get them crowned again. But if you're careful, it shouldn't take too long. It's not too hard to do this, you just have to pay attention. At this point, it's a good idea to file off the ends of the frets, just round them off a little bit. Where the top of the fret meets the end that was filed flat, there can often be a little sharp bit, so we just go along with the crowning file and just take those off. And now we're ready to polish the frets. I'm going to start with some 400 grit sandpaper. I'm going along the ends first, and then I'm polishing along the length of each fret afterwards. And we'll go from 400 grit, 600, 800, 1200, and then all the way up to 2000 grit sandpaper, because you want those frets to be as polished and smooth a playing surface as possible. And if you come in along the edges after you've polished the length of the fret, then you wind up with little burr marks on each end of the fret. So we just polish the ends first and then polish the length of the fret. There it is, the finished playing surface. Nicely polished. You just give it a final inspection and make sure you haven't missed anything. There's still a few little bits of Sharpie left, but we'll clean those up with some wax and grease remover in just a little bit. But first, we're going to fill in the fret slot ends with some wood filler. This is just standard wood filler you can buy anywhere. You can do just about anything you want to fill these. I've heard of people using crayon. I've heard of people just using wood glue mixed with sawdust. I happen to have some wood filler, so I'm using that. Okay, let's take a moment to talk about inlays. I don't generally put dot inlays or any other kind of inlays on the front of the fingerboard because I don't really like the look of them. I've had basses that had just straight clean fingerboards. I really like that look. Plus, not having the dots doesn't actually affect the playing all that much because you're not looking at these dots while you're playing. While you're playing, you're looking at these dots. They are essential. What I've done in the past is I've used barbecue skewers. Really easy, really cheap. They glue in nicely and they just work well. Except, you can't see a dot made out of a bamboo skewer on a darkened stage. That's a problem. So what I'm going to do this time is I've got some white acrylic and I've just tried shaping a little bit of it on the disc sander there. And that seems to work quite nicely, so I'm going to slice it up, drill some holes. I'll probably epoxy them in. And that'll be that. It took me a surprisingly long time to cut these up. I'm cutting them into 4mm sections, but using that craft saw is probably not the best. They're so small that as soon as you get so far through the cut, they would break off and go flying across the room. So I eventually did manage to find them and then marked out the neck and drilled some holes. You really got to have your wits about you when you're dealing with epoxy on this neck because you don't want to get any on the fingerboard, you just want to get enough in the hole to glue the dot in. The other thing to remember is that it's a 5-minute setting time on most cheap epoxy that you'll find around the place. There's 12 dots to glue in, so that gives you 25 seconds per dot. So you gotta move fast. Right, so that epoxy's had a couple of hours to set. We're going to sand off the neck, and I'm just sort of doing it by feel. I'm not really measuring anything, but when it feels right in my hand, now that we've got the frets in it, I can feel how big it is, and I know when I've got it right. I'm using 120 grit, so that it's going to take off a reasonable amount of material, but it's not going to take off so much that we run the risk of damaging the neck. Now that I've got that sanded out, I did it by hand to 180, and now I'm going to slop on some sanding sealer. I just want to fill the grain in, and then we'll sand it all off flat later, so I'm not too worried about the surface finish on this. I should be using a brush ideally, but I don't have one, and we just want to slop it on thick, so I just grabbed a rag, and that's what I'm using. Now that's had a chance to dry, it's time to fit the neck to the body. Now this involves very carefully using a piece of string to make sure that the centre lines are aligned, and then marking out where the neck is going to go. There's no router template for this. There is in fact no router. I've found that on such a delicate thing as a neck pocket, I like to get in there with the hand chisels and just remove a fragment of wood at a time. With a router you can do the job a lot faster, but the potential for screwing it up is a lot greater. Router makes a big mess in a real hurry. So I'm just perfectly happy to spend half an hour with some chisels and just hollow this out by hand. Okay, what we have here is a neck that's pressed into half a neck socket. It's a very tight fit. In fact, it will pick up the instrument by itself. There's no glue, there's no bolts in there yet. We've got to make sure that this is straight. We do have a little bit of wiggle room because it is so tight, and we haven't cut the full depth to make sure that ultimately we wind up with no wiggle room, and the neck goes on dead straight to the centre line. And to do that, we need to make sure that we have got it straight. I've got this bit of string taped to the headstock here. It's dead centre. Line it up, pull it tight, and I've got the centre line marked on the back of the end of the neck here. I don't know if you can see that, but I'm going to line up the string right there. Make sure it's pulled tight, and press that onto the centre line of the body like so. Now, you just sight up the length of the neck and make sure that's straight. If it's not on straight, what you'll see is that at this point here, you get a little pivot point. If the neck wasn't lining up with the centre line of the body, then you get that happening. Yep, that's good. All we need to do now is finish this neck pocket to the correct depth, and then I think we can move on to the next thing, whatever that is. What I've done here is actually switch to using a different chisel. The black-handled one that you've seen before is starting to get a little bit blunt, so I switched to a blue-handled one which is nice and fresh and sharp, and I'll put the black one over to be sharpened up later. Having a really sharp chisel will make sure that when I'm doing the final cut, I can get that back of the neck socket nice and flat, nice and even, exactly the way we want it. There it is, a nice tight fit. Time to drill the holes that are going to secure the neck to the body. One thing that people often get wrong when they're building an instrument is that a bolt-on neck should have the bolts be a slip fit through the body and the threads grab into the neck and pull the neck onto the body. If you have the threads biting into the body and the neck, then they can bind and get some separation between the two, which you can never pull out. I've just changed to a smaller drill bit, and I'm just going to plunge the holes through the body into the neck before coming in with a spade bit to drill the recesses for the ferrules. One of the very last things I need to do to this body is to cut a recess for the control cavity cover. I'm just coming in with the router, and I'm more or less just doing this freehand. The idea is that whatever shape I make now, I will sand the shape into the control cavity cover later. Just a skim pass to clean everything up, and then we are ready for the final sanding. I'm going to sand the whole body with the detail sander to 60, then to 120, and then I'm going to sand with 180 by hand. One of the greatest tricks that no one ever taught me was that sanding with the direction of the grain isn't enough when you're dealing with a cut on an angle and any kind of end grain. You have to sand away from the end grain. It's like you're sanding downhill, in a downhill direction. If you try and sand uphill in this situation here, then it's like rubbing up a cat the wrong way. You're never going to get a good finish. And when you're dealing with multiple curves on multiple angles, you really do have to pay attention to which direction you are sanding in, because if you just rub back and forth, you'll never ever be able to sand it out. You'll also see me come in with the detail sander occasionally, because as you're sanding to a finer finish, any large scratches or any rasp marks that may still be there become more visible. So I'm just taking care of those with the detail sander, and then coming straight back over with the 180 by hand, make sure I get this finish just as nice as it can be. Now it's time for some sanding sealer. I found a brush. I'm just slopping that on there as thick as I can. We'll let that dry overnight, and tomorrow we'll sand it out and get ready to spray some polyurethane. Time now to sand out the neck and the body to 240 grit in preparation for spraying. I'm spraying an oil-based polyurethane, which I've thinned out with turpentine. I'm just doing a very, very thin coat at first and making sure that I haven't got any danger spots where, if there's, say there was some grease on the body that it didn't want to adhere to, then I wouldn't have a massive pile of polyurethane to sand off after it sets. So I do a thin coat, make sure it's okay, and then I'll go and put a slightly thicker one over the top of that. Then I'll give it about an hour, and then I'll go and put a third coat on top of that. That'll give a nice thick coat. The reason for waiting an hour is just so that you're not putting it on so thick that it runs. You need the base coat to be set, but not hard, so the next coat can melt into it. And that's where they'll hang for the week. Thank you everyone for watching. Next week we're going to put it together and play it. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and you'll get to see that. Thanks.